Oh my god, what the fuck is that? Oh my god. Minecraft is a horror game. Now, I've deliberately chosen this specific wording in order to subvert your expectations. When you hear the phrase horror game, your mind probably jumps to the typical conventions of the horror genre, and if I wanted to, I could play into this, rattling off all the ways in which Minecraft can be scary and spooky and filled with jump scares, but there are people that have already done that, to much greater success than I ever could. Instead, I want to approach you with a different prospect. Minecraft is a horror game because it simulates the horror of existence. In order for me to sustain this claim, we're going to have to turn our attention to a pretty well-known figure, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. Oh yes, this video is about Nietzsche, and I am very excited to delve in. So, if you don't know, or have only heard his name in passing, Nietzsche was a 19th century German philosopher who wrote about quite a lot of different things. It would be quite the tedious process to go through them all here. His life was quite the interesting one. Even more fascinating was his posthumous explosion in popularity. However, to keep things pertinent to the topic of this video, I am going to be focusing on his philosophy about suffering, and how this fed into his understanding of the horror of existence. Nietzsche spent a great deal of his life deconstructing the morality of contemporary Western society. One of his best attempts at doing so can be found in his 1887 work on the Genealogy of Morality. In it, Nietzsche provides 3 essays that all work towards tracing back the historical lineage of morality as we know it. What makes this work so interesting is that it does not begin with any presuppositions of objective truth in regards to morality. Instead, Nietzsche uses historical context to analyse how many of our modern values came to be. This is also where we get some of Nietzsche's insight into the role of suffering in mankind's development. In the second essay, Nietzsche explores the origin of guilt and bad conscience. In this essay, he touches upon how, in an effort to hide from the meaninglessness of suffering, man resorted to means such as the infliction of suffering upon others, upon those who were seen as in debt. Nowadays, when suffering is always trotted out as the first argument against existence, as its most sinister query, it is well to remember the times when men judged on converse principles because they could not dispense with the infliction of suffering. Nietzsche shortly afterwards talks about how many of mankind's systems of religion and systems of custom provided a sort of aegis from this question of the meaning of suffering. What really raises one's indignation against suffering is not suffering intrinsically, but the senselessness of suffering. Such a senselessness, however, existed neither in Christianity, which interpreted suffering into the whole mysterious salvation apparatus, nor in the beliefs of the ancient man, who only knew how to find meaning in suffering from the standpoint of the spectator, or the inflictor of suffering. Here we find one of Nietzsche's core conclusions about suffering, that mankind is too scared to face up to the meaninglessness of suffering, so actively seeks out morals and values and practices that give suffering a role, a purpose, a teleology. In the third essay, What is the Meaning of Ascetic Ideals?, Nietzsche explores the almost universally found practice of asceticism, the denial of indulgences, self-imposed constraints. What's interesting is that Nietzsche gives us the answer at the very beginning of the essay, where he says, "But in the fact that the ascetic ideal has meant so much to man, lies expressed the fundamental feature of man's will, his horror vacui. He needs a goal, and he will sooner will nothingness than not will at all." It is this aphorism that Nietzsche proceeds to unpack throughout the rest of the essay, Mankind's horror vacui, his fear of empty space in the canvas of the universe, goes back to his fear of the meaninglessness of suffering. For suffering to have no meaning results in an empty space, a void, as Nietzsche puts it. This is where the ascetic ideal comes in, providing a meaning to man, a purpose for his suffering. And the arbiters of this ideal are the ascetic priests, who according to Nietzsche prescribe, though in the most cautious of doses, what is practically a stimulation of the strongest and most life-assertive impulse, the will for power. This is where we must be careful to draw some distinctions. Nietzsche does not condone the ascetic ideal, he's simply explaining the purpose that it has served for humanity. This does not mean that Nietzsche supports the idea. This is made clear when he goes on to explain that the ascetic ideal, in the process of filling the void around humanity, brought with it new suffering, more potent suffering, self-inflicted suffering in the form of guilt. As an example, the Christian notion that man is inherently sinful and thus deserving of suffering. In that ideal, suffering found an explanation. The tremendous gap seemed filled. The door to all suicidal nihilism was closed. The explanation, there is no doubt about it, brought in its train new suffering. Suffering under the perspective of guilt. This is what Nietzsche means when he says that man would rather will nothingness than not to will at all. People in their desperation turn to anything that offers them a solution, a purpose in the grand, cruel scheme of existence. It does not matter to them if the solution rejects life itself, because they see it as being better than having no solution at all. Okay, that was quite the concentrated dose of Nietzsche. And at this point you may be thinking to yourself, this is cool and all, but what does that have anything to do with Minecraft? Well, underpinning Nietzsche's views on suffering is the notion that existence itself is horrible and cruel. And is that not exactly what single-player survival Minecraft is? I mean, think about it. Steve, a man stuck in a world that is endlessly cruel to him at every turn, where suffering imposes itself on him ruthlessly, where literally every day hundreds of monsters are out to kill him, to destroy him, where he is condemned to an eternity of loneliness, where he is inflicted by hunger and pain, all without a purpose. Yes, you could argue that the purpose in the Minecraft world is to unlock the achievements, or to defeat the Ender Dragon. I mean, it is literally called the End, right? But is that the purpose? The game does not require you to do any of those things, and even doing them does not provide a fulfilling and long-lasting meaning. Instead, Steve simply exists in a world that is cruel to him at every turn, a world where he suffers endlessly, a world which on top of that provides him no meaning as to the purpose of his existence, an existence filled with horror. At this point, it is necessary for us to define what is actually meant by the horror of existence. In his book, Nietzsche, Eternal Recurrence and the Horror of Existence, Philip J. Kain says that it, the cosmos, was not designed for human beings at all, nor were they designed for it. We just do not fit, we do not belong, and we never will. The cosmos is horrible, terrifying, and we will never surmount this fact. It is a place where human beings suffer for no reason at all. It is best never to have been born. Let us call this the horrific cosmos. This is Nietzsche's view. Not only is this the view of Nietzsche, it is also the reality of Minecraft. It is the reality that Steve exists in. So now we arrive at a new question. How do we deal with suffering? How do we deal with the horror of existence? And in order to answer this question, we must once again turn to Nietzsche. I can go. I can't. After all that doom and gloom, you might be compelled to think that Nietzsche's philosophy seems quite nihilistic. This, however, is not exactly the case. His philosophy can be more accurately described as life-affirming. A great example of this can be found in one of his most well-known responses to suffering and the horror of existence. And if you've been paying attention to this video, you might realize that I've already mentioned this certain Nietzschean concept. That's right, let's talk about the will to power. However, before I begin talking about this concept, I want to establish two key footnotes. Firstly, the distinction between the two types of the will to power. Firstly, there is the book that is called The Will to Power, and then there is the actual concept itself, which only takes up a portion of the book's ideas. Secondly, I maintain a slight hesitation when referring to ideas from the book, The Will to Power. This is because The Will to Power isn't really Nietzsche's book. That is to say, it isn't exactly his vision. It is a book that is made up of parts of his notes, which his sister Elizabeth put together and published after his death. There are a few problems with this. The book is drawn from his notes, which means that the ideas contained within are far from refined. Furthermore, Elizabeth was anti-Semitic, and this prejudice manifested itself openly when she put together the book. Nevertheless, the book contains some interesting ideas, so I shall be referring to it today, but I do encourage you to take this book with a grain of salt. In The Will to Power, Nietzsche says, "To those human beings who are of any concern to me, I wish suffering, desolation, sickness, ill-treatment, indignities." This, at first glance, sounds quite harsh. Does Nietzsche endorse suffering? Does he think it's a good thing? No, Nietzsche does not think that suffering is either good or bad. Instead, he thinks that suffering is an intrinsic, inseparable part of life, of existence. Life is made up of suffering just as much as it is made up of joy. To wish to abolish suffering or lessen it is to wish the same for joy, and vice versa. This is what I mean when I say that Nietzsche affirms life. He thinks that suffering is necessary for humans. It acts as a test of their strength. Nietzsche follows up by saying, "I have no pity for them, because I wish them the only thing that can prove today whether one is worth anything or not, that one endures." Nietzsche thinks that humans need suffering in order to thrive, in order to push themselves to their extremes, to become their better selves. Philip J. Kain expands on this point. The very nature of things, the very essence of existence, means suffering. Moreover, it means that suffering for no reason at all. That cannot be changed. It can only be concealed. Furthermore, for Nietzsche, we cannot reduce suffering, and to keep hoping that we can will simply weaken us. Instead, we must conceal an alien and terrifying cosmos if we hope to live in it, and we must develop the strength to do so. We must toughen ourselves. We need more suffering, not less. This is where we arrive at the will to power, the concept. Although Nietzsche didn't fully define the idea in his lifetime, it can generally be ascertained that it represents the drive within humans to be powerful and dominant. Not so much physical domination over others, but the domination over oneself. Power achieved by enduring and overcoming in the face of suffering, to attain power over life itself. This means a form of self-overcoming in the face of the horror of existence, which means overcoming suffering itself. This is what Nietzsche means when he says he wishes for more suffering, because according to him, it is the ability to face up to suffering that fully reveals one's character, one's will to power. The will to power is the fundamental core of all humanity, which one must channel if one wishes to achieve greatness. This, therefore, is the pivotal part of Nietzsche's response to the horror of existence. With all of this in mind, let me offer you this interpretation of Minecraft, one that correlates with the idea of the will to power. The basis of this interpretation is that Steve, and by extension the player, has to endure and overcome the suffering and the horror of existence in Minecraft. As a result, the ultimate aim of single-player survival Minecraft is the process of self-mastery and self-overcoming, striving to be a better, more powerful individual, to affirm life in all its joys and sufferings, to achieve greatness. This is the task of Steve, the will to power. Now, this interpretation of Minecraft through the lens of Nietzsche's philosophy is inevitably open to scrutiny and dispute. At the very least, this interpretation is one that is interesting to entertain. To end this video, let me leave you with one final excerpt from The Will to Power. Quote, "What is the actual worth of our valuations and tables of moral laws? What is the outcome of their dominion? For whom, in relation to what? Answer: for life. But what is life? A new and more definite concept of what life is becomes necessary here. My formula of this concept is: life is will to power." Thanks for watching.